The silence in the cabin was louder than the shouting that had come before. It was a hollow, ringing silence, packed with the things her 5 brothers-in-law had left unsaid. Della stood by the cold hearth, her hands clasped so tightly the knuckles were white mountains on a barren plain. They thought her small, they thought her weak. A city-bred woman, Thomas's little eastern bird, who would surely perish now that her cage was broken and her keeper was in the ground. The scent of turned earth from the new grave still clung to their boots. Jedediah, the eldest, the one who spoke for the rest, cleared his throat. He was a thick man, built of the same stubborn rock and timber as the mountains that loomed over their small valley. It's settled then, Della. The stage comes through on Friday. We've sold the stock back to the Miller Ranch. It's not much, but it's enough for your ticket home and a little besides. Home. The word was a stone in her throat. Home was Philadelphia. A place she hadn't seen in 3 years, a place of brick and coal smoke and crowded rooms she had fled for the sharp, clean air of this wild land. Home was this cabin, built by her Thomas's own hands. It was the smell of pine in the walls and the feel of worn floorboards beneath her bare feet. It was the one place on earth that was hers. No, she said. The word was small, but it landed in the quiet room with the weight of an anvil. 5 pairs of eyes, all sharing the same shade of faded blue, fixed on her. It was Luke who spoke next, his voice softer, laced with a pity she despised more than Jedediah's bluster. Della, be reasonable. You can't stay here. A woman alone. It ain't right. It ain't safe. This is my home, she repeated, her voice gaining a sliver of iron. The deed is in my name, Thomas saw to it. Jedediah scoffed, a harsh, grating sound. A piece of paper won't keep you warm when the first snow flies. It won't fill your belly when the larder's empty. We are your family. We know what's best. He gestured around the room, at the bare shelves they had helped to empty, at the hooks where the smoked hams had hung. You'll never survive the winter alone. It wasn't a warning. It was a judgment, a prophecy they intended to see fulfilled. They saw a helpless widow. They did not see the woman who had nursed Thomas through the fever that finally took him, who had learned to read the sky for weather and the ground for tracks. They did not see the steel that hardship had forged inside her. She lifted her chin, meeting Jedediah's gaze without flinching. You have said your piece, now I will say mine. This is my land, this is my house. You will leave. The shock was a physical thing, rippling through them. They had expected tears, pleading, grateful submission. They were not prepared for defiance. For a long stretched moment, the tension held, thick as molasses. Then, with a grunt of disgust, Jedediah turned on his heel. Have it your way, but don't come crawling to us when you're starving. We wash our hands of it. One by one, they filed out, their heavy boots thudding on the porch boards. The door swung shut behind them, and the latch clicked with a terrible finality. Della stood frozen in the center of the room, listening to the sound of their horses fading down the valley. Alone. The word was no longer a condition. It was a challenge. A dare. The late afternoon sun slanted through the single window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. She looked at her hands, no longer clasped, but hanging loose at her sides. They were chapped and capable. They knew how to set a snare, how to gut a rabbit, how to stitch a wound. They would be enough. The first breath of autumn whispered through a crack in the doorframe, and Della did not shiver. She had a winter to prepare for. Weeks bled into one another, each day a litany of tasks. Della worked from the first gray light of dawn until her muscles screamed in the bruised twilight. She chinked the logs of the cabin with fresh mud and moss, sealing every crack against the coming cold. She sharpened Thomas's axe and spent days in the woods, the rhythmic thud of steel on wood a conversation with the silent pines. The woodpile grew into a fortress wall against her home. She was a scavenger, a squirrel hoarding for the long sleep. She gathered the last of the wild berries, boiling them down with precious sugar into dark, sweet preserves. She set snares along the creek bed, her heart a cold knot each time she found a rabbit or a grouse, but her stomach grateful. She learned the silent language of the land, a language of bent twigs and faint tracks in the dust. She grew leaner, harder. The soft edges of her city life were gone. planed away by work and worry. Her property bordered the vast holdings of the Black Creek Ranch, a sprawling empire of cattle and grass owned by a man as formidable as the land itself. Asa, she knew of him only by reputation. A man who had built his kingdom from nothing. A man who had lost his wife years ago and had sealed himself away from the world ever since. The town whispered he was cold as a banker's heart, hard as a coffin nail. She saw his riders sometimes, distant figures moving along the ridges, but never the man himself. Her small homestead was a forgotten postage stamp on the edge of his world. The first encounter happened on a crisp October afternoon. The air was sharp with the smell of pine and decay, the aspen trees along the creek a riot of gold. Della was checking a line of snares near the northern fence line, a dilapidated thing of rotting posts and rusted wire that marked the boundary with Asa's land. That's when she heard it, a low, pained bellow, followed by the thrashing of a large body. She moved cautiously through the undergrowth, her small skinning knife clutched in her hand. It was a bull. A magnificent, terrifying creature, black as coal, with a chest like a barrel and horns that could gut a grizzly. It was one of Asa's prize bulls. She knew from the brand on its flank. It had pushed through the weak fence, and now its hind leg was horribly tangled in a thicket of thorny brush and old wire. Blood, dark and stark, stained its hide. The animal was frantic, twisting and pulling, only making the tangle worse. Just as she was trying to gauge the distance, a rider appeared on the ridge above her. He sat his horse like he was born to it, a tall, broad-shouldered silhouette against the pale sky. He didn't move for a long moment, just watched. It was Asa. She knew it instantly. He had an aura of stillness, of immense contained power. He urged his horse down the slope, his movements economical and sure. He pulled up a few yards away, his eyes, the color of a stormy sky, sweeping over her, the bull, the broken fence. They were cold, assessing eyes, and they missed nothing. "This you're doing?" His voice was a low rumble, devoid of accusation but heavy with suspicion. Della shook her head. Her throat suddenly dry. She kept her voice steady. "Found him like this. He's caught fast in the wire. He'll tear his leg to ribbons if he keeps fighting it." Asa dismounted, his gaze never leaving the struggling bull. He was bigger on the ground, a wall of muscle and leather. He carried the weight of his solitude like a mantle. "He'll kill anything that gets too close." "Not if you calm him first," she said, surprising herself with her own boldness. "He's more scared than angry. If you talk to him, low and steady, I can get close enough to see where the wire is biting." He looked at her then, a flicker of something unreadable in those gray eyes. Disbelief? Annoyance? She couldn't tell. He expected her to run, to cower. He didn't expect advice. For a moment she thought he would tell her to get lost, to mind her own business. Instead, he gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. He moved toward the bull's head, not directly but in a slow, circling approach. He began to speak, his voice a deep, soothing murmur, the words indistinct but the tone a balm. The bull's wild eyes rolled, but the desperate thrashing subsided, replaced by deep, shuddering breaths. Seeing her chance, Della moved in from the rear. She was light on her feet, her movements practiced and quiet. She crouched down, her senses filled with the animal scent of the bull, the smell of its blood and fear. The wire was wrapped tight, cutting deep into the flesh above the hock. She saw how to free it. A single loop that held the rest of the tangle fast. "There's a loop," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "If you can get him to shift his weight forward, I can pull it free." Asa murmured to the bull, stroking its massive neck. The animal grunted and shifted, a small movement that was just enough. Delta's nimble fingers found the wire loop. It was slick with blood. She pulled, her muscles straining. For a heart-stopping second it held, and then with a metallic scrape it came free. The rest of the tangle fell away. The bull stood, trembling but untethered. It looked from Asa to Della, then with a snort, it limped away, favoring the injured leg. Asa watched it go before turning his gaze back to her. He stood straight, his expression as unyielding as before. She expected thanks, or at least an acknowledgement. She received neither. He walked to the broken section of fence and studied it. "I'll send a man to fix this tomorrow." He turned, swung himself into the saddle with fluid grace, and looked down at her. His shadow fell over her, cool and vast. You ought to be more careful. This is no place for a woman on her own. It sounded just like her brothers-in-law, but coming from him. It felt different. It wasn't a dismissal of her abilities, but a flat statement of fact, as impersonal as the granite cliffs. He didn't wait for a reply. He wheeled his horse and rode away, leaving her standing in the golden afternoon with the scent of blood and pine in the air. She watched him go, a strange mix of resentment and fascination stirring within her. He hadn't helped her, not really, but he had listened. And for a man like Asa, that felt like a concession as vast as his ranch. The first snow came not as a gentle dusting, but as a sudden, violent squall that roared down from the mountains without warning. It turned the world white in an hour, burying the valley in a thick, silent blanket. Della was ready. Her cabin was warm and snug, the fire in the hearth a cheerful crackling heart. The scent of wood smoke and baking bread filled the small space. From her window, she watched the snow pile up, feeling a grim satisfaction. Let it snow, she thought. I am ready for you. She spent the days of the storm mending clothes, reading the few books Thomas had owned, and rationing her supplies with a careful hand. The isolation was profound. The world had shrunk to the four walls of her cabin and the white fury outside. Some moments, a deep loneliness would press in on her, so heavy it was hard to breathe. She missed Thomas with an ache that was a physical presence, but she did not allow herself to wallow in it. Grief was a luxury she could not afford. Survival was the only currency that mattered. A week after the first storm, a brief thaw set in, followed by a vicious cold snap that locked the land in a sheath of ice. It was on one of these brutally cold days that a knock came at her door. It was so unexpected that for a moment she thought she'd imagined it. No one ever came to her door. She took Thomas's old shotgun from its pegs above the mantel before she lifted the latch. Two men stood on her porch, their faces red with cold, their breath pluming in the frigid air. They were Asa's men. She recognized their jackets. Between them, they were half carrying a third man, his face pale and beaded with sweat despite the cold. His pant leg was soaked through with a terrifyingly large patch of dark red. "Mom," the older of the two men said, his voice strained. "Name's Gus. We was felling timber up on the ridge. Ben here." His axe slipped. "It's a bad one. We can't get him to town in this, and the bunkhouse is too far. We saw your smoke." Della didn't hesitate. "Bring him in. Put him on the floor by the fire." She shut the door against the cold and knelt beside the injured man. The wound was horrific, a deep, gaping gash in his thigh that had been clumsily bandaged with a ripped shirt. He was losing blood, and fast. Della's mind went quiet and clear. The panic she might have felt was replaced by a cold, focused calm. This was a problem to be solved, like a broken tool or a leaking roof. "Hold him steady," she commanded, her voice crisp with authority, "and get that kettle on the fire. I need hot water. And bring me my sewing box from that shelf." The two cowboys, who likely took orders from no one but Asa, moved to obey without question. There was a certainty in her voice that demanded it. Della carefully cut away the blood-soaked fabric. The wound was deep, all the way to the bone. She knew it needed stitches, and it needed them now. She washed her hands with lye soap and then washed the wound, her touch gentle but firm. The man, Ben, groaned, his eyes fluttering. "Gus," she said, not looking up. "There's a bottle of whiskey in the cupboard. Give him a long swallow. It's all I have for the pain." She threaded a needle with strong linen thread, her fingers moving with a practiced efficiency she'd learned stitching torn canvas and leather. Then she began to sew. She worked steadily, her world shrinking to the small damaged landscape of the man's flesh. She placed each stitch with precision, pulling the edges of the wound together, stemming the bleeding. The cowboys watched in silence, their faces a mixture of awe and horror. When she was done, she stood and went to a small chest in the corner. From it, she took a bundle of dried leaves. She crushed them in a bowl, mixing them with a little hot water to make a thick green paste. The sharp, clean scent of yarrow filled the air. She spread the poultice over the stitched wound and bound it tightly with clean strips of linen torn from a worn sheet. It should hold, she said, her voice tired but satisfied. The yarrow will help stop any more bleeding and keep the fever down, but he needs to stay warm and still. Just as she finished speaking, the door opened again. Asa stood there, framed in the doorway, a blizzard of fine snow swirling in behind him. He looked like a force of nature, his face grim, his duster coated in white. His gaze took in the scene in an instant, his injured man by the fire, his other two men looking shaken, and Della, her hands and apron smeared with blood, standing over them like a general on a battlefield. He stepped inside, his presence filling the small cabin, sucking the air out of it. He knelt by Ben, his large hand gently touching the man's forehead. He looked at the clean, tight line of stitches, at the professionally applied bandage. He looked at Ben's color, which was already starting to return. He then slowly lifted his eyes to Della. He didn't speak for a long time. He just looked at her, and for the first time, the ice in his eyes seemed to have thawed. There was a deep, grudging respect in his gaze, and something more, something she couldn't name. He had come expecting to find a disaster, a man bleeding out on a dirt floor while a hysterical woman wrung her hands. He had found a sanctuary, a field hospital, a place of quiet, life-saving competence. "You did this?" he asked. His voice was quiet, stripped of its usual hardness. Della simply nodded, too exhausted to speak. He rose to his full height and looked at his other men. "Gus, you stay with him. Sam, ride back and bring a sleigh. We'll move him when he's stable." He then turned back to Della. He reached into his coat and pulled out a heavy purse. "For your trouble." She looked at the coins, then back at his face. "I don't want your money," she said, her voice firm. "Your man was hurt. I did what anyone would have done. Not anyone." He said, his voice a low murmur. "Not like this." He hesitated, the purse still in his hand. He seemed at a loss, a man unused to being refused, unused to feeling gratitude. He placed the purse on the mantelpiece anyway. "He's my man. I pay his debts." He looked around the small, warm cabin, his eyes lingering on the neat stack of firewood, the tidy shelves of preserves. He was seeing her, truly seeing her, for the first time. Not as a foolish widow or a stubborn squatter, but as something else entirely. Without another word, he turned and left, disappearing back into the storm. Della watched him go, a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. She had proven herself, not to her brothers-in-law, not to the town, but to him, and somehow that felt like it mattered more. In the weeks that followed, a strange, silent communication began between the small cabin and the great ranch. Della would wake to find a sack of flour on her porch, or a haunch of venison hanging from a hook by the door. Once, it was a small barrel of salted fish. There was never a note, never a sign who left it, but she knew. It was Asa's way, acknowledgement, a repayment of a debt he felt he owed. He was a proud man, and this was the only way he knew to offer help without making it seem like charity, without wounding her own fierce pride. She, in turn, would leave a loaf of freshly baked bread on the top rail of the fence that separated their properties, or a small jar of her berry preserves. It was her saying, "I see your offering, and I accept it not as charity, but as a neighborly exchange." It was a conversation held in goods, not words, a delicate dance of pride and provision across the frozen landscape. One morning, the handle on her well pump shattered in the bitter cold. The metal, made brittle by the frost, simply snapped in her hand. Without the pump, she would have to haul water from the creek, a dangerous, back-breaking task in the ice and snow. She spent the better part of the morning trying to rig a solution, her fingers numb, her frustration mounting. Asa found her there. He didn't seem to be patrolling his fences. He seemed to have ridden directly to her cabin. He swung down from his horse and surveyed the situation with his usual terse economy. "Broke. The cold," she said, her teeth chattering. "It's frozen solid." He didn't offer sympathy or platitudes. He simply took off his thick leather gloves, tossed them on the well housing, and got to work. He had tools in his saddlebags, tools she'd never seen before. He built a small fire near the pump's base, shielding it carefully from the wind until the ice that had seized the mechanism began to groan and drip. He worked with a quiet, focused intensity. Della brought him a hot cup of coffee, which he accepted with a nod, his calloused fingers wrapping around the warm mug. They worked side by side for over an hour, mostly in silence. He showed her how to brace a piece of wood to serve as a temporary handle, how to wrap the pipes in burlap to insulate them. Their hands brushed once as they both reached for the same tool. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt of warmth through her that had nothing to do with the fire. In the shared, quiet space of their labor, a strange intimacy grew. It was the intimacy of a shared task, of mutual competence. He didn't treat her like a fragile woman. He treated her like a partner in the work. When he was finished, he tested the pump. It moved stiffly, but it worked, bringing up a stream of clear, cold water. "It'll hold for now," he said, pulling his gloves back on. "I'll have a new handle forged at the ranch and bring it by." "Thank you, Asa," she said softly, using his name for the first time. He looked at her, his gray eyes seeming to search her face. He just nodded, then mounted his horse. "Keep the pipes wrapped," he said, and rode away. She watched him until he was a small dot against the snow, her heart beating a little faster. He hadn't just fixed her pump, he had come. He had noticed she was in trouble, and he had come. The deepest part of winter arrived in the form of a blizzard that the old-timers would talk about for years. For 3 days, the world outside ceased to exist. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, and the snow piled in drifts that buried her windows, casting the cabin in a dim, perpetual twilight. Della kept the fire roaring, the warmth a fragile shield against the immense cold. She felt like a passenger on a tiny ship, tossed on a vast white ocean. On the second night of the storm, she was startled by a loud, insistent pounding on her door. Her first thought was that the wind was trying to shut her loose, but it came again, rhythmic and deliberate. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her. No one could be out in this. She grabbed the shotgun, her hands trembling slightly, and called out, "Who's there?" "Asa." The voice was muffled by the wind, but unmistakable. She fumbled with the latch, her heart hammering against her ribs. He practically fell inside, bringing a blast of ice and snow with him. He was covered in it, his eyebrows and mustache white, his duster a solid sheet of ice. He looked less like a man and more like a winter spirit, elemental and wild. "What are you doing?" she cried, helping him pull the heavy door shut against the storm. "You'll be killed out there." "Had to check my fences," he muttered, though they both knew it was a lie. The fences would be buried under 10 feet of snow. He had ridden out in the heart of the blizzard for her. The unspoken truth of it hung in the air between them. He was shaking, not just from cold, but from exertion. "Get that coat off," she ordered, her fear turning into a flurry of activity. "Come by the fire." She helped him with the frozen duster, which stood stiffly on its own when she leaned it against the wall. She pushed him into the rocking chair by the hearth and wrapped him in the thickest wool blanket she owned. She poured him a mug of coffee, her hands hovering near his for a moment as he took it. His were shaking too badly to hold it steady, so she held it for him as he drank. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the scream of the wind outside. The storm that raged outside seemed to emphasize the profound peace and safety within the cabin walls. Here, in this small bubble of warmth, they were the only two people in the world. "You shouldn't have come," she finally said, her voice soft. He looked at her over the rim of the mug, his eyes dark in the firelight. "I had to know you were all right." The admission was stark, stripped of all his usual defenses. She felt a powerful wave of emotion wash over her. He had risked his life, not out of duty or debt, but out of a personal, undeniable need to know that she was safe. She looked away toward the fire, her heart too full. To break the charged silence, she asked him about his ranch, about the cattle. He began to talk. He spoke of the bloodlines of his horses, of the challenges of a rancher's life, of the father who had taught him the land. He spoke more in that hour than she imagined he had spoken in years. Then, he fell silent and looked at her. "What about you, your husband?" She found herself telling him about Thomas, about their dream of building a life here. She spoke of his kindness and his laughter, her voice thick with memory but free of the sharp edges of fresh grief. Talking about him with Asa didn't feel like a betrayal. It felt like an honoring. Asa listened, his gaze steady and patient, his presence a solid, comforting weight in the room. He was a man who understood loss. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He just listened, and his listening was a gift. As he spoke of his late wife, just a few halting words about her love for wildflowers, Della saw the deep, unhealed wound he carried. He had built walls of ice around his heart, just as the winter had built walls of snow around her cabin, and she realized with a sudden, breathtaking clarity that she was sitting inside those walls with him. The storm began to break near dawn. The wind quieted its howling to a low moan. Asa stood, stretching his stiff limbs. The air in the cabin was thick with unspoken things. He walked to the door, his movements heavy. He paused with his hand on the latch and turned back to her. He looked as if he wanted to say something, something important. His gaze dropped to her hands, then back to her face. But the moment passed, the walls went back up. "Thank you for the coffee," he said, his voice once again gruff and distant, and then he was gone, leaving her alone with the smell of wood smoke, coffee, and the lingering, powerful presence of the man who had ridden through a blizzard just for her. The winter finally broke. Patches of brown earth appeared on the sun-facing slopes, and the creek began to whisper under its thinning shield of ice. The world felt new, reborn. Della had survived. She had faced the worst the land could throw at her, and she was still standing. A fierce, quiet pride filled her. She had proven them wrong. It was this feeling of victory that made the sight of the riders so jarring. There were 3 of them, making their way up the muddy track to her cabin. One was Jedediah, the other was the town marshal, a man named Cobb with a weary face and a drooping mustache. The third was a stranger in a town suit. A cold dread washed over Della, chilling the warm spring air. This was not a social call. She met them on the porch, the shotgun held loosely in the crook of her arm. Jedediah wouldn't meet her eyes. He looked smug, his righteousness a sour smell on the air. It was Marshal Cobb who spoke, his voice apologetic. "Mrs. Miller, I'm sorry to trouble you. Your brother-in-law here, he's filed a petition with the territorial judge." He held out a piece of paper. "It declares you unfit to manage your own affairs. Cites your precarious living situation. Says you're a danger to yourself. The judge has granted him temporary guardianship." Della stared at the paper, the words blurring. Unfit, guardianship. It was a lie, a legal trick. They couldn't force her out with threats, so they were using the law to steal her home. "That's not possible," she whispered. "The deed is in my name." "The deed ain't the issue, Mom," the marshal said, his voice heavy with regret. "The judge is concerned for your welfare. Jedediah here is to escort you back to town, where arrangements will be made for your return east." Jedediah finally looked at her, his face a mask of false concern. "It's for your own good, Della. We told you this would happen. You're alone and helpless. We're just doing our duty as family." The fight drained out of her. How could she fight a piece of paper? How could she fight the law itself? She had battled the snow and the cold, the hunger and the loneliness. But this felt like a blow she could not parry. She looked past them, at the mountains that had been her silent companions all winter, at the sturdy cabin that had been her sanctuary. They were taking it all away. For a moment, a wave of utter despair washed over her. They were right. She was alone. She had lost. Her shoulders slumped. The shotgun felt impossibly heavy in her hands. "You have an hour to pack what you can carry," Jedediah said, his voice dripping with triumph. It was then that another rider appeared, coming not from the town road, but from the high country, from the direction of the Black Creek Ranch. It was Asa. He rode not at a gallop, but at a steady, deliberate pace, his big stallion eating up the ground. There was an implacable purpose in the set of his jaw. He rode straight up to the porch and dismounted, his movements fluid and dangerous. He didn't even glance at the others. His eyes found Della's, and in them she saw a raw, protective fury that stole her breath. He stepped between her and the 3 men, a silent, immovable wall of leather and muscle. He was not armed, yet he was the most menacing thing she had ever seen. Marshal Cobb cleared his throat nervously. "Asa, this is a legal matter. It doesn't concern you." Asa's gaze shifted to the marshal, and his voice was lethally quiet. Everything that happens on this mountain concerns me, Cobb. And this land borders mine, Jedediah scoffed, emboldened by the law on his side. She is our family's responsibility, a lone woman, clearly not in her right mind, trying to live out here like a savage. We are taking her back to civilization, where she belongs. Asa slowly turned his head to look at Jedediah. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. This woman survived a winter that killed 2 of my best steers and drove a wolf pack down into the lowlands. The only thing she needs protection from is your greed. Then he turned his back to the men and faced Della fully. The fury in his eyes softened into something else, something raw and vulnerable and true. In front of the marshal, in front of her smug brother-in-law, he laid his heart bare. "It seems you have a choice to make, Marshal," Asa said, his voice ringing with a strange new authority. "Because you're not just trying to evict a widow. You're trying to evict my future wife." The words hung in the stunned silence. Delsa's heart stopped, then started again with a painful thud. Jedediah's jaw dropped. Even Marshal Cobb looked utterly flabbergasted. It was a public declaration, a choice that would set the whole territory gossiping. It was an irreversible act, tying his name, his reputation, to hers. He was shielding her with his power. But Della knew her own rescue had to be her own. Asa's shield had given her the moment she needed to find her footing, to find her voice. She stepped forward, moving to stand beside him, not behind him. She held the marshal's gaze, her own eyes clear and steady. "Marshal Cobb," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. "My brother-in-law is a liar. My husband Thomas knew his family. He knew they would try something like this." She turned and walked back into the cabin, the men watching her every move. She returned a moment later with a small tin box. From it, she removed a folded, worn document. Thomas had the deed drawn up in my name alone before he passed. He filed it at the territorial office in the capital, not the local land office. He also had a letter drafted by the lawyer there, affirming my soundness of mind and my sole ownership in the event of his death. She handed the papers to the marshal. "His signature is on the bottom, and it is notarized." The marshal took the documents, his eyes scanning them. He was a lawman, and he respected the written word, the official seal. He looked from the deed to Jedediah, his expression hardening. "This seems to be in order. The petition for guardianship is based on the assumption that the property was your brother's, but it is hers, and has been since the day he died." She had done it. Her quiet foresight, Thomas's love, had been the final weapon. Asa had provided the time, the space for her to act, but the victory was hers. He had rescued her from despair, and she had rescued them both from the law. The rescue was mutual. Jedediah sputtered, his face turning a blotchy red, but there was nothing he could say. The law was the law. Defeated and humiliated, he and the man in the suit mounted their horses. The marshal tipped his hat to Della. "My apologies for the intrusion, Mom." He turned to Asa. "Asa." He nodded once, then rode away, leaving them standing in the sudden peaceful quiet. A week later, the world was alive with the promise of spring. The air was soft and smelled of damp earth and new leaves. Della was on her porch, mending a tear in a canvas sack, when she saw him riding up the path. Asa was not on his usual imposing stallion, but on a gentler, calmer mare. He dismounted and walked toward the porch, his spurs making a soft, hesitant sound on the damp ground. He held his hat in his hands. The silence between them was different now. It wasn't the comfortable silence of shared work, nor the charged silence of unspoken feelings. It was the awkward, hopeful silence that follows a world-changing revelation. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, looking up at her. The usual iron mask of control was gone from his face. He looked younger, uncertain. He looked like a man who had taken the biggest risk of his life and was waiting to see if it would break him. "Della," he started, his voice rough. He cleared his throat. "What I said, in front of the marshal, it was not just to stop them." He took a step up, then another, until he was standing in front of her. He was so close she could see the flecks of silver in his gray eyes. "I meant it. I've been alone for a long time. I thought it was what I wanted. I thought it was what I deserved. I built a fortress of a ranch, and a fortress of a life, and locked myself inside. He reached out, his calloused fingers gently touching her cheek. His touch was hesitant but warm. And then there was you. In this little cabin with nothing and no one, building your own fortress. Not of stone and anger, but of courage and grit. You didn't just survive the winter, Della. You lived it, you fought it, and you won. He took a deep breath, the words coming hard for a man so used to silence. My brothers-in-law, they said I'd never survive the winter alone. She whispered, her voice catching. They saw a woman who couldn't survive, he said, his voice a low, fierce murmur. I see the only one who could. His hand moved from her cheek to cup the back of her neck, his thumb stroking her skin. I don't want to be alone anymore, Della. I want to stand on this porch with you and watch the seasons turn, if you'll have me. She looked into his eyes, into the heart of this powerful, broken man who was offering her all the pieces of himself. He had seen her, truly seen her, from the very beginning. He had respected her strength when no one else had. He had ridden through a blizzard for her. He had stood against the law for her. Tears welled in her eyes, tears not of sorrow, but of a profound soul-deep relief. She had found her home. She didn't offer a grand speech. Her life on the frontier had taught her the value of simple, sturdy things. She leaned into his touch and gave him a small, watery smile. I survived the winter, Asa. I reckon I can survive you. For the first time since she had met him, a true, genuine smile broke across his face. It transformed him, chasing the shadows from his eyes. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of fiery passion, but one of quiet homecoming. It was a kiss that tasted of wood smoke and coffee and the promise of a shared spring. He pulled back and simply held her, his arms strong and sure around her. They stood on the porch of her small, sturdy cabin, looking out at the greening land that stretched before them. A land that was no longer a place of exile or survival, but a place of promise, a home. The story of a love found in the harshest of winters reminds us that our greatest strength is often forged in the seasons that threaten to break us. If you found yourself rooting for Della's courage, please like this video. Subscribe for more stories of frontier hearts, and ring the bell so you never miss a new tale. Have you ever had to prove someone wrong about what you were capable of? Let us know your story in the comments below. Until next time, may you find warmth in the coldest of nights.